Natural Habitat Adventures is pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, A World Apart, Winter in Yellowstone, presented by Kurt Johnson, and he's coming to us live from Jackson Hole, Wyoming today. Kurt is a naturalist, author, and photographer with a passion for ecotourism. He grew up in both the urban setting of Northern Virginia and the remote Adirondack Mountains of New York State, where he developed his interest in natural history. He studied wildlife biology in Wisconsin, acquired an additional BS in education and an MS in natural resources in Utah, and has since studied wildlife all over the world. Kurt has been guiding wildlife tours and teaching about wildlife for more than 15 years, including organizing and leading safaris in Kenya and Baja. He also teaches photography and leads astronomy programs. And his recent published book, The Field Guide to Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, is the most comprehensive identification and natural history guide ever written about these two famous parks, and represents Kurt's efforts to communicate the big picture of ecosystem rather than focusing only on the most charismatic megafauna. So we're just delighted to be here with you today, Kurt, and thank you for taking the time.
Hey, thank you, Lee. Appreciate that introduction. And welcome everybody to my world. I'm talking to you from just outside of Grand Teton National Park in the paradise called Jackson Hole. This is my home. This is where I live with family and friends, and basically lead expeditions like the ones that I'll be speaking to you about today, that take place in this wonderful backyard of Grand Teton, the National Elk Refuge, and the world famous Yellowstone National Park. And so to begin, I would like to just paint a picture of this area as a whole, which we oftentimes collectively refer to as the GYE, which just stands for the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And I like to think about this area on the ecosystem level rather than the specific lines that outline Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. And so with this map, you can see our perfectly rectangular shape of Wyoming, with Cheyenne down on the bottom right. And we're focusing today on the northwest corner. And to explicitly show you what the GYE represents, we're talking about a very big ecosystem, an ecosystem which is oftentimes referred to as the only intact ecosystem in the lower 48. And so the second map that overlays the first one shows you how much bigger this ecosystem is than just Yellowstone itself. Yellowstone is the upper box that's a near rectangle, but not quite, that comes in just over 2 million acres. And then you can see Grand Teton outlined just to the south of that. And so if you look well beyond those two national parks, you can see that we are in the heart of a true wilderness here that comes in somewhere around 18 million acres. And that's really one of the real magical things about this ecosystem, is simply how wild it is, how large it is. And that's what's really necessary in order to have true wilderness and to have a place where things like wolves, grizzly bears, wolverines, and lynx can call home. It comes down to the fact that we have very little development in this ecosystem and quite a bit of open, untouchable public land. And so there's really several NatHab trips that we offer here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'll be focusing on the winter ones, but occasionally one might dip into some of our other trips that take place here in the fall. We'll be starting one here 1 week from today, which is called Hidden Yellowstone. So we do that in the fall and the spring. And then we also offer a trip called Yellowstone Quest, which tends to take place in March and April. I oftentimes refer to that trip as Advanced Yellowstone because it's a really in-depth introduction into the northern range of Yellowstone, which I'll be talking about throughout our conversation today. But for the most part, I'll focus on one of the trips called Ultimate Yellowstone. And so what this map does is it just gives you a rough outline of the route. And it can go one of two ways. It's a one-way itinerary, which I think is one of the things that makes it real special. So it either goes Jackson to Bozeman, Montana, or Bozeman, Montana to Jackson, Wyoming. And what this allows is for a really extensive exposure to basically the entire ecosystem, because it covers the ecosystem from its very northern range to the more southern range of Jackson and Grand Teton National Park. So the ultimate Yellowstone will be the one that I focus on the most. And one thing to keep in mind is that on these trips we work very, very hard to make them exceptional. And one of the ways that we do that is we use customized safari vehicles that are very comfortable and winterized, so they're very warm. But as you can see in this image, they also are customized with roof hatches, not unlike African safari vehicle. And this allows for better viewing, better photography, and very comfortable conditions, even when it's quite cold. And so let's assume that we're taking this journey from Jackson to Bozeman, just as an example. And so winter in this ecosystem is purely magical. And so here you can see what really is a fairly common sight is under these massive peaks, the Grand Teton Range, the valley of Jackson Hole, which is made up mostly, but not entirely, of Grand Teton National Park, is home to a plethora of wildlife, including one of our favorites. Our moose are very common, and we see them quite frequently during the winter. And that brings up a common question that I get, because I take a lot of people out throughout the year, including in the summer months. And people say, do you really see things during the winter? Isn't it too cold for the animals? The reality is that winter is maybe the best time for wildlife viewing. And the animals tend to congregate in specific areas. They're not migrating and moving around day to day very much. And so most of our wildlife, their limiting factor in life are warm temperatures as opposed to cold temperatures. So a hard day for a moose like this would be a warm 80-degree day in August and July. And this moose is very happy in January and February when it gets down to potentially -20 and potentially even colder, because that's what they're adapted for. Our wildlife is adapted to these cold temperatures. And so on the ultimate Yellowstone, we would take a couple days to explore Grand Teton National Park, looking for things like moose. One of the real jewels of Jackson Hole is another part of the ecosystem called the National Elk Refuge. And this is a refuge run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that's about 25,000 acres. So it's a big piece of land, largely untouched by human hands, and brings in between 6,000 and 8,000 elk every winter. It's a really amazing thing to experience. And on our Yellowstone itinerary, we include a private sleigh ride that has been taking place on the refuge for decades. And what that means is that the elk are not spooked by our presence. They don't mind the horses that pull the sleighs. They don't mind us as long as we stay in the sleigh. And it's a really, really unique opportunity. So the elk refuge is certainly one of the highlights of Jackson Hole. And as you can see here, this is not an uncommon sight to see on the National Elk Refuge, is to see thousands and thousands of elk, but other animals as well. And so our bison herd of Jackson Hole, which is separate from the bison herd of Yellowstone, they don't tend to overlap very much. They come down, they move on to the refuge. They're basically doing that right now, and they'll continue to do that for the next couple of months. So we have the potential to see the bison on the refuge. Other things move in, like eagles and coyotes. There's a wolf pack that dens on the refuge, and other things come in as well. And we sometimes can be creative with our photography. If the elk are running in pursuit of something or from something, we can slow down our shutter speed and have a little fun with that. And one of the all-time favorites for many of us during the winter, either on the elk refuge or in a few other specific spots in Yellowstone, are the bighorn sheep. And this is an example of a hoofed mammal with a very, very violent courtship. And so these are two rams that are battling, that are clashing it out in competition for the females. And it's something that we occasionally do see into December and early January, because their courtship is much later than most of our hoofed mammals. So for example, our bison rut, our courtship, has basically already ended. It ends typically in August, and then we still have another couple of weeks until the moose and the elk rut, but the bighorns take their time, and so theirs typically peaks in November and December, and so occasionally we get to see this amazing behavior of bighorn sheep going at it. And this picture looks a little funny to me, but that was a pronghorn. Somehow that image is not coming through very well, but pronghorn are one of my favorite animals. I consider them to be the Ferraris of the animal kingdom, and they can get up to speeds of 60 miles per hour. They are not as well adapted to winter conditions as some of our animals, like the moose and this big guy. Bison are certainly an animal we love to see any week of the year. They are majestic. They are now, as of last summer, the national mammal of the United States. They've always been the state mammal of Wyoming, but they are now officially the national mammal. And they are very well adapted to snowy conditions, to cold conditions. And this is one of the poses that we oftentimes seek out, is a frosty bison on a cold Yellowstone day. And we look for that by watching their behavior, because this may not be a spectacular photo in and of itself, but we watch for this particular behavior of them accessing the grass deep down underneath the snowpack, because what they do is they turn their entire head into a snowplow, and they take that massive head carried by the massive muscles on their shoulders, and they take that head into the snow, go back and forth to access the grass, and then if we're lucky, it'll raise its head and we'll get that nice frosty bison picture that we're always looking for. Bear with me, trying to forward through here. Oh, too much. Hang on. Okay. And then we're always blessed with things that are unexpected. Not that many of our animals hibernate. Some of our animals do migrate out of the region. A lot of our birds do migrate out of the area, but also other birds move in. But a lot of our animals, including some rodents, do not hibernate. And so that means that we have the potential to see things like porcupines, which technically are rodents, and a lot of rodents do hibernate to deal with our harsh winters. But porcupines are typically active throughout all winter, and that can be something that we can stumble upon on occasion. And then we have really quite good bird life as well during the winter months. And so this is something we oftentimes look for. This is North America's largest waterfowl. This is the trumpeter swan. And you have to really give them credit for being able to be so well adapted to handle our cold conditions, snowy conditions, and yet we can see trumpeter swans 365 days a year in this ecosystem, and they are just stunning to watch. Other things can be more discreet. But I would say during our winter trips, we have a much greater chance of seeing this little guy. This is an American dipper. And American dippers are just tough. They're just a little bit smaller than a robin, and yet they are oftentimes one of the favorite animals, including mammals, in an ecosystem like this, because they are very well adapted to cold temperatures, to the point that they are actually feeding underwater, oftentimes underneath ice, on invertebrates that are found in our fast-moving creeks and rivers. So American dippers are oftentimes a great mascot for winter in Yellowstone because they are tough, they deal with cold conditions quite well, they are active all winter, and throughout it all they're singing, which I think is kind of cool. They're singing all winter long, which most birds do not do. It's also a good time for birds of prey. And so here we've got several different species of birds of prey. In the top left corner, we've got golden eagles, which we tend to see more frequently during the winter than we do any other time of year. So we have a good chance of seeing goldens. And then on the top right, that's a young bald. And I oftentimes show this image to portray how it can be kind of tricky to identify the eagles. If it's an adult bald eagle, it's pretty easy because they've got that distinct white head and white tail. But a younger eagle can look a lot like a golden eagle. So we oftentimes talk about different strategies to tell the two eagle species apart. But we see bald eagles frequently during the winter. So they are a common year-round resident here in Wyoming. The next one down underneath the golden is a red-tailed hawk. Most of our red-tails move out of the region, but some do stick around. But what's really interesting is the one to the right of the red-tail and underneath the young bald eagle, because that's a rough-legged hawk. And we love to see those during the winter because they are Arctic breeders. So they breed up in the northern Arctic and then winter in tropical areas like Jackson Hole, because in their minds, this is much more temperate than where they come from, which is northern Canada, northern Alaska. So let's get into some of the predators of this area. This ecosystem is home to 3 canines. And I like this image because it gives a good size comparison of our 3 canines, the largest being the gray wolf, and then the coyote, and then the red fox. And so all the canines are active all winter, and they are just enormously fun to watch and never dull. All canines are very complicated, very intelligent, and so they are never boring. They're always doing something, interacting with one another, pursuing prey, adopting other hunting strategies, including some strategies that we saw for the first time last year on our trips. And definitely one of the highlights of winter in this area are the predators, and these 3 canines are 3 of the top. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of the significance of having wolves in this ecosystem, because we went for quite a long time without wolves. We went about 60 years in this ecosystem without our top predator, which would be the equivalent of going into the Serengeti and saying, you know what, we don't need African lions in the Serengeti. Let's remove them all. No one seems to think that would be a good idea, but that's exactly what we did throughout the lower 48. We did a great job of removing just about every single wolf. And the last wolf in this area was killed in the 1930s. And then it wasn't until the mid-90s when over the decades it was realized that this top predator played a very important role in the health of the ecosystem. And so by the mid-90s, the wolves were reintroduced into this area, and it's had a profound effect on the ecosystem. Ecologically, in a very, very good way. Politically and culturally, it gets more complicated than that, which I'll touch on here in a little bit. So if we look at the historic range of gray wolves, you can see that they were dispersed across North America, and they were not just a Western species. And then, as I said, we eradicated them. And there's only one state that actually did not completely eradicate wolves. And that state sometimes is surprising to people, but that state is Minnesota. So all the Western states did remove all the wolves. And then based on these reintroductions that took place either actively through transporting wolves from Canada into the Rocky Mountains, or in the case of northern Montana, the wolves reintroduced themselves. They came down into Glacier National Park on their own. So this is a little bit more accurate in terms of how our wolves are doing now. And so these wolves from this ecosystem have expanded into other parts of Wyoming, as far south as Utah. There are now wolves in Oregon and Washington, and this map doesn't reflect it, but there is now officially wolves in Northern California. So this can be kind of a tricky thing. When we see a canine far off in the distance, we want them all to be wolves, but they are oftentimes coyotes. And so we look at a lot of different variables when we try and identify a canine. Red foxes are pretty easy, but about half of our gray wolves are gray and the other half are black. So if you see a large, dark canine, you can be fairly certain it is a wolf. But if it's gray, then you want to look at other things, like if you have a sense of size, wolves are about 3 times larger than coyotes, and their anatomy is a little bit different as well. And so wolves do have longer legs proportionally. Their ears are a little bit different, and even the way that they move can be different as well. And by that I refer to the fact that coyotes usually walk with their tails down, and wolves are a little bit more likely to walk with their tails up. So we use a lot of different factors when trying to identify these coyotes, especially if they're at a longer distance away. And so I love the naturalist Gary Larson, who was a naturalist in addition to being a cartoonist, and I think he portrays really well sort of why we did it. What is the innate fear of wolves that that is found in humans? And Hollywood doesn't help this. Hollywood oftentimes portrays wolves as frequently attacking people, although the reality is they just simply don't. There has not been a single incident of an aggressive wolf in this ecosystem. But I love this cartoon where he refers to our innate fear of wolves being due to something called lupus lipophobia, which he says is the fear of being pursued by timber wolves around a kitchen table while wearing socks on a newly waxed floor. And I kind of like that because it speaks to the fact that a lot of our hatred, or certain cultures' hatreds towards wolves, is not founded in reality. We don't have much to worry about with wolves. They do not attack people, and they do get into trouble when it comes to livestock occasionally, but that's actually quite rare as well. But this is a common scene in places like Yellowstone in the early days of these parks. Biologists, people like me, naturalists, they saw these areas as really having two types of wildlife: the good wildlife, things like elk and deer and bison, and then the bad wildlife, which were the predators, the mountain lions, wolves, coyotes, and to a lesser extent bears. And so there was active removal practices, and so national parks would actually hire government trappers to remove predators like wolves, and we did it very, very well. And as I said earlier, the last wolf in the area was removed by the 1930s. So for 60 years, we basically didn't have the top predator. And you can imagine that had a profound effect on the elk populations, the other predators. Their numbers were kind of thrown out of whack. And so it was recognized that this ecosystem in particular would benefit from the return of gray wolves. And so it was very controversial. It remains very controversial, but it was determined that wolves should be trapped, live trapped up in Canada. So they came in from first Alberta, then British Columbia, just for 2 years, in 1995 and 1996. And so these wolves were brought in, and for the first time in 30 years, brought into Yellowstone. This is the Northern Range, which I'll refer to here and there. And so these are oftentimes sites that we can visit, because these wolves weren't just brought into Yellowstone and these pens weren't just simply open and they were let go, because there was concern. There was concern that the wolves wouldn't stay. And so this cartoon from a local paper in the 1990s shows the real concern. You can see that it shows a sign saying "Welcome to Yellowstone National Park," and the concern was that the wolves would actually leave and try and get themselves back to Canada. And considering how far wolves can roam, that was not unrealistic. And so rather than just release them in something called a hard release, it was determined that a soft release would be much more effective. And so what that means is that acclimation pens were set up in 3 different sites in the northern range of Yellowstone. And the idea of this was to give the wolves exposure to the ecosystem so that they became more comfortable with the sights and the sounds, and most importantly, the smells of Yellowstone. So for several weeks, they were kept in these pens, and roadkill was brought into them to give them a taste of the local wildlife. And then finally, after a few weeks, the pens were open, and the wolves, for the first time in a very significant chapter in the story of Yellowstone wolves, were set free and roamed Yellowstone for the first time in a very, very long time. Now, what this map shows, I'll leave it up here for a few seconds so you can really look at it. It shows the expansion of wolves from 1995 to 2002. So if you start with 1995, you can see that there were 3 different packs. And those were the 3 original packs brought in from Canada that first year. And so you can see it started with those 3 going into 1996. More wolves were brought in from Canada. And then from there, what you're seeing from 1997 to 2002 is a natural expansion of the wolves throughout the entire region. And you can see how quickly they expanded well beyond the northern range, and eventually down into Grand Teton and the Elk Refuge by about 1999. And the analogy which is oftentimes used is that it was sort of like a desert that hadn't experienced a torrential rainstorm in decades, and suddenly there's lots of rain and the desert just turns into an explosion of wildflowers and plants, because that's sort of what happened here, and that the wolves did so well because it was like they were able to just find these niches throughout the entire ecosystem that had been unoccupied by a top predator for so long. And so that's why you can see such tremendous growth over a relatively short amount of time. And if we bring up what we're looking at about today, this is just the Yellowstone packs. And you can see that basically you can see wolves just about anywhere throughout the ecosystem. And so no matter where we are, we kind of always have our wolf radar turned up, hoping to get a glimpse of a wolf. But the reality is that there is just one section of Yellowstone that we really turn our wolf radar up high, and that is the northern range. So that northern section where you can see the Cinnabar pack, the 8 miles, the Prospects, the Junctions, and the Lamars. And you can imagine each of these packs has a story. Each wolf has its own story, but each pack has a pretty emotional story tied to it. And that's oftentimes some of the things that we dive into when we are in the field and exploring these areas together. As I said earlier, ecologically, this was a no-brainer. This was a very positive thing for Yellowstone and the surrounding areas. But it was fought tooth and nail by people who really felt that this was a horrible thing. And we worked very hard to remove this predator. And so the fact that we would intentionally bring it back in just didn't make sense to a lot of people. And so here you can see an anti-wolf rally. I attended this. This was downtown Jackson a few years ago. And you can see a wolf pelt draped across the podium there as different voices are contributing to their strong feelings against wolves being in this ecosystem. And there's still a very, very loud voice that says that, you know, wolves need more control, hunting needs to be increased, and they are having a very detrimental effect on the ecosystem. That's, in my opinion, admittedly, is very biased from a wildlife biology perspective, but I do try and understand all points of view on these issues, and so that's why I attended this, is just to hear what the other voices were. And you can see on the sign some of the concerns that the wolves are gonna have a really detrimental impact on moose, on elk, deer, antelope, sage grouse, and refer to wolves as poachers, and refer to the Endangered Species Act as being broken. And so all sorts of passionate feelings on both sides of this issue. This is a helpful image as it basically gives a snapshot of what the wolf populations have done in between 1995 and 2016. And so you can see that the populations really peaked around 2003 and 2004, where the numbers, just within Yellowstone, this isn't the ecosystem-wide population estimates, this is just within the 2 million acres or so of Yellowstone, and the numbers did get pretty close to 200. And then if you follow that, you can see that it has stabilized, and so for the last few years, we've been looking at numbers of around 100, just in Yellowstone. One thing to take a look at, I'm not sure if the colors are coming through of the different bar graphs, but one thing you can look at year to year is that even though the northern range of Yellowstone, and that includes Lamar Valley, some of you may be familiar with that part of Yellowstone. Lamar Valley, which is sometimes referred to as the Serengeti of North America, is part of the northern range. And one thing you can see if you follow the bar graphs and look at the dark blue bar, you can see that consistently about half of Yellowstone wolves have been in just that small section of the northern range. And so that's why we make a point of including the northern range in all of our itineraries, because it's an amazing part of the world. It's very, very remote, and we stay in remote areas, very civilized, but it's far from the Four Seasons, and just make a point of spending time in this amazing area. And on the one trip that I mentioned, the one itinerary called Yellowstone Quest, we definitely spend just about the entire itinerary in the northern range, because there's so much to see, so many opportunities up there. And that's why I refer oftentimes as the Quest trip as being like advanced Yellowstone, because it's a really intensive exposure to this really spectacular part of Yellowstone. I like to show this image just because the reality of wolf watching is that they are oftentimes at a distance. So we carry spotting scopes, high quality, high powered spotting scopes. And as you may tell, since most of these images are my images, I'm a serious photographer, and yet it is very difficult to get a photograph of a wolf. And so one of the things that we do, which is why this image has been included, is that we can use smartphones. So this was actually taken with an iPhone, but it was taken with an iPhone held up to a spotting scope, which is kind of a clever trick, and one of our most effective ways to get videos and stills of wolves, because they are usually at a distance. We occasionally get lucky and come into close proximity to a wolf, but there's a big part of me, and I'm always sort of conflicted, because I'm part naturalist who just likes watching and experiencing wildlife, and I'm part photographer, and that the photographer part of me likes to be, in some close proximity for subjects. But the reality is we tend to see more interesting things through a spotting scope than through a camera, just because the animals are behaving more naturally and exhibiting more natural behavior through a scope. And so that brings us to the dynamic between the different canines. So this is an image of two coyotes, and showing how just a minute before this image was taken, the coyotes were just bedded down next to one another, and then something changed and their temperament changed, and for a brief second they were very, very violent with one another. And that's sort of representative of the relationship between all the canines. And so none of the canines like one another, and typically the wolf packs themselves don't like one another. And that's why those ranges that you saw on the previous map are so important, because if a pack of wolves leaves their range and goes into the territory of another pack, they're taking a risk, because they are crossing into like basically another territory which that pack will defend. I think this is the only image from this slideshow which is not mine, but I like to include it because it does such a great job of not only showing the relationship between wolves and coyotes, but also showing the size difference. So this was a very common scene, especially when the wolves first came back, because you can imagine that for those 60 years between the mid-30s and the mid-90s, the coyote literally became the top dog of Yellowstone. And so their numbers grew and grew and grew. And so once the wolves were reintroduced into the ecosystem, then we saw a change in the coyote population. We actually saw a decline of about 50% of the coyotes as the wolves kind of restored that natural balance between those three canines. And we can't leave out the smallest of the canines, but definitely one of the more fun canines to watch during the winter. Maybe my absolute favorite thing to experience in winter is a red fox hunting. And you can see that sequence down at the bottom that shows basically what they do. It's a different sort of hunting strategy than coyotes will do, or that wolves will do, because all three of them will potentially hunt rodents. But coyotes typically do a jump, a lot like you're seeing the red fox do, but they land feet first, whereas a red fox does something pretty spectacular where they do this leap based entirely on what they're hearing underneath the snowpack. So they can't see what they're hunting. If they can hear something down below, they take their time, they kind of tense up, and then they do this big leap, and end up landing head first into the snowpack. And so if we're very lucky, we get to see that behavior. And it's just it's a really wonderful progression of hunting strategies to be able to see in the wild. Other predators that are in the area are weasels, and so we have river otters, which are part of the weasel family. They are exceptional hunters and prey primarily on fish. And in my mind, I feel like river otters are such good hunters. They're so effective and so efficient at catching their prey that they actually have a lot of time on their hands. And that's not the case with very many animals. Most animals, especially in the winter, they're working constantly to conserve energy, or if they're going to expend energy, it's got to be for a very, very good purpose, like pursuing prey. But otters seem to have a lot of time on their hands, and so they are goofballs, basically. They are fun to watch. They are playing constantly, wrestling, and truly seem joyous when you watch them just very elegantly glide through the waters of the ecosystem. We do have badgers as well, and badgers can be seen any month of the year. They do not hibernate, and they are a wonderful animal to see in the wild. Their superpower of a species is their ability to dig. So they can be found oftentimes digging up other hibernating rodents, things like ground squirrels. You might be able to see in this image that their claws are formidable, and their temperament is notorious as well. So they're not that big, about 20, 30 pounds at the most, but they're very stocky, and their temperament is such that they've been known to intimidate things like black bears off of the kill, just through sheer intimidation. During our winter trips, we don't always see bears. So that would be the one thing that's a little bit harder to see during the winter. But some of our other itineraries do experience bears. So I thought I would talk about them briefly. So currently for our fall trips, we have a chance of seeing grizzly bears and black bears. I would say a very good chance. And grizzly bears in particular, they don't hibernate until much later in the winter. Black bears will basically disappear by mid-October. It's probably the last time we can expect to see a black bear. But grizzlies can be active well into December and January. So that's why it's a possibility to see them. And then male grizzly bears actually come out quite early. And so during our quest trips, which take place in March and April, we oftentimes, I think for the last couple of years, we've actually been maybe some of the first people in North America to see grizzlies come out of hibernation. And that can be really any week in March or April, but that's kind of a nice thing to look forward to. And another unique thing about the ecosystem is that we do have two species of bears. We've got grizzlies and blacks. This is a young grizzly bear. And we, just like discerning coyotes from wolves, we like to look at a variety of different features to tell who's who, because it's not always easy. And one of the reasons it's not that easy is because about half of our black bears are brown. They're cinnamon black bears. And so it happens quite frequently that people see a cinnamon black bear and they turn it into a grizzly in their mind. So things we look for are that big shoulder hump on the grizzly bear, more of a dish-shaped face, whereas black bears tend to have more of a Roman nose. And if you're especially close, you might be able to notice that the claws of a grizzly bear are about 3 times longer than that of a black bear. So when we think about this ecosystem and Yellowstone in particular, the reason that Yellowstone is the world's first national park, and that's something that many of us take great pride in saying, and we say it at every opportunity that we can, because it is truly the world's first. And so all national parks throughout the United States and throughout the world are based on the model of Yellowstone. And when it became the world's first national park back in 1872, the thing that really distinguished it from anywhere else around the world was the geology. So typically most of us fall in love with this area because of the wildlife, but the geology plays a big role in the landscape. And so the geothermal activity within Yellowstone is certainly one of the highlights. And there are about 10,000 geysers, hot springs, fumaroles, and mud pots spread out throughout Yellowstone itself. And they always look great. They're always interesting. They're always beautiful. And like I said, a big part of the story of Yellowstone. But it's worth pointing out that during the winter, they look 1,000 times better. And so as much as we don't always love getting up in the morning when it's very, very cold out, there's a big part of people like me, at least, that kind of hope for those really, really cold days, because that's when the geyser basins look their most amazing, when you get the contrast of near boiling springs with near freezing temperatures outside. So this was taken in right around Old Faithful on a cold winter morning. And so recognizing that the geology is a critically important part of the story of Yellowstone, I like to show a slide like this. And so if you look at the top, let's see, yeah, more or less the top right corner of this map, you can see that this is an image that I downloaded from the internet just today. And so what this shows you is Yellowstone and the ecosystem and how active it is in terms of seismic activity. And so the reason that there's 10,000 geothermal things within Yellowstone is all because of the volcanism, due to a tremendous amount of molten rock or a magma chamber underneath Yellowstone, which is driving all those geothermal geysers and hot springs. And that magma chamber is also affecting the terrain in terms of seismic activity. And so if you look at this map, you can see that just in the last couple of weeks, there's been about 124 earthquakes. These are mostly small. We don't feel them very often, but it speaks to the fact that this is a very dynamic area geologically. This is a nice overview of the ecosystem as well. You can see the national park boundaries in yellow for both Grand Teton and then further north into Yellowstone. And the reason I think so many people love this area for its geology is because it's got just about everything from a geology 101 textbook can be found in this ecosystem. So we've got active glaciers in the Tetons. We've got the entire landscape has been formed by massive glaciers that have receded. We've got mountain building. So the Teton Range is one of the best examples of recent mountain building, which makes them look so dramatic, is because they are relatively new. And also volcanism. And so you can see the red lines in the middle of Yellowstone, which represent massive volcanic eruptions on the scale that are oftentimes referred to as super volcanoes. Again, driven by all the magma and molten rock that's relatively close to the surface of the earth underneath Yellowstone compared with anywhere else around the globe. So lots and lots of geologic influence on this area. And that's what drives imagery like this. I've been to Old Faithful, I'm not sure how many times, maybe pushing 1,000 times. I've photographed it maybe almost as many times. But the moments that we really get excited about are those wintry moments when you've got cold air and Old Faithful itself, which constantly is emitting steam, and then about every 90 minutes or so releasing many thousands of gallons of water, but over 100 feet up into the air. Oop. And with that, I will thank you once again for joining me and NatHab on this webinar experience. And hopefully this gives you a little bit of an overview of what makes this place truly unique, truly special around the world. There's nothing else quite like it. And with that, I think we probably have some time for any questions you might have about Yellowstone, about our wildlife, or about the itineraries that we offer.
Thank you, Kurt. This is Lee, and it was just a fabulous webinar. We actually have someone who traveled with you in January of 2017, and just appreciated being on with you today to have those great memories. So that's cool. The first question that we have is about the weather, always a popular question. How cold does it get, and does NatHab provide coats, boots, that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And so the packing list for a trip like this is critically important because we want you to be very comfortable. And so we do provide Arctic caliber parkas and winter boots that are rated to -30 or -40 or something. And we always carry hand warmers and foot warmers and pay very close attention to comfort because cold is a reality. And like I said, you know, the cold makes for oftentimes better conditions, but it still doesn't mean that we want to be uncomfortable. And so we can have spells down to -20, -30. And Yellowstone's a little bit higher than Grand Teton, so it can be even colder up there. But I'd say the average temperature is going to be closer to 10 most mornings and easily warming up to 20 or 30 some days. But we try and have everyone prepared for conditions that can be down to -30. We typically have just a handful of days per year that are -30, but we like to be ready for those days. And those days tend to be some of our favorites in reality.
Yeah, I bet they're really actually pretty amazing. Photography equipment. I know you mentioned almost all photos but one were yours today. What kind of photography equipment, lenses and so forth, do you recommend that people take with them? Do they need a tripod, monopod?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And something that I really should have touched on is the fact that each of these itineraries can be either a photo trip or a non-photo trip. I lead a mixture of both, but I'm oftentimes involved in the photography trips in Yellowstone. And there's no reason that a photographer wouldn't join a non-photography and a non-photographer would join a photography trip. But you can imagine they have slightly different emphasis. And we tend to carry more tripods for people on the photography trips. We carried bean bags, and then we tend to focus our discussions quite a bit more on photography on the photo trips. So that's an important distinction. And in terms of gear to bring, Yellowstone is kind of the land of long lenses, and so it oftentimes is a week that people consider renting a longer lens. Like if it's not something you use day to day back home, it may not be something you want to really invest a whole lot of money in, since lenses are the most expensive part of photography. So that would be something to consider is bringing your longest lens along with your landscape lenses. But of all the places to travel to, it's might be the one to really consider renting something bigger.
Okay. And how does the equipment do in this kind of cold? How does it perform?
Performs surprisingly well. I photograph constantly throughout the winter, and I really don't see, even on our most cold days, I don't typically see a whole lot of battery drain. Obviously, we carry extra batteries because that's going to be the first thing to freeze up. And we do, one of the first things that we do talk about, especially on a photo trip, is strategies for shooting in cold temperatures, because our equipment can perform quite well, but there are some tricks that we can utilize to increase in the caliber of our photography for cold conditions.
Okay, thank you. What about group size? How many people are in a group?
The vehicles take 11 passengers each, and we make a point of making sure that we never come close to full. Our goal is to always have everyone at a window, and no matter what seat you're in any of these sprinters, these customized vans that I showed an image of, you always have access to the hatch. And so each vehicle will never have more than 7 people in them.
Okay, thank you. And then how active are the trips? Do you need to be very physically fit?
Not necessarily, no. We offer more physical activities, just because that's oftentimes people want more of that. Some people want more. Some people would prefer not to be involved in that. And so we do have snowshoes accessible. And so at least once at some point in the trip, we'll go for a snowshoe hike. It might be up a little gorge. It might be out to see a kill that was made long ago, so we're not going to disturb the wildlife. And occasionally we actually walk out to an old wolf den and check out a wolf den. So we basically, and that's one of the nice things about having two vehicles, is that we can kind of divide and conquer. So we can split up the groups, and one half of the group can go for a snowshoe and the other half can do more wildlife watching and exploring that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then what about the lodging? Could you speak a little bit about where everyone will be staying?
Yeah, the lodging is very civilized and very comfortable. The lodging in Jackson is at the Lexington Hotel, which we've been using for a really, really long time. Very comfortable, very nice, just about a block from downtown Jackson. And then in Yellowstone, we sometimes stay inside the park, just outside of Old Faithful, or in really nice cabins in West Yellowstone. Both are great options for different reasons. And Cook City, which I will say is one of my favorite places in the world, is extremely remote. So we do like for people to be kind of prepared to be in the middle of nowhere. And so, for example, the town does not have any cell service. The Wi-Fi is there, but not very dependable. And yeah, and there's restaurants that stay open throughout the winter, and we stay in the nicest lodging available up there, which is still it's fairly simple, but still extremely comfortable, warm, and clean. And like I said, it's the nicest lodging for probably 150 miles.
Well, it sounds great. Thank you. A couple more camera questions, and then I think we can wrap it up. If you're going to rent a lens, what do you suggest for a zoom lens?
Yeah, I think with most of the major brands out there, a favorite lens that a lot of people find very, very effective out here is a 100 to 400, just because it's got a lot of reach, but it's not overwhelming in terms of its mass, and so it can be handheld or put on a tripod. Some of them you can get a converter for and add a little bit more reach to it. And then on our photography trips, we occasionally get someone who's coming in with a 500 millimeter, and that can be a good thing as well. It takes up a lot of room. It's very, it's slower to use just because it's heavy and takes up space and things like that. But some people would only come here with a 500 millimeter. But that's a beast. It's a beast to carry. It's a beast to set up. And yeah, to purchase one it's a small fortune, and it would be expensive to rent one as well. But that's for hardcore photographers, that would be the lens of choice out here is a 500.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good to know. All right, well, I'm going to stop there and turn it back to you for closing comments that you might like to share with our audience.
Okay, well, thanks for helping set this up, Lee, and thank you to everybody who attended the webinar. And hopefully this inspires you to come visit us here in Wyoming someday. And if there's anything that I can help you out with directly, I'm sure you can contact me through NatHab, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks again for joining.
Yes, and my thanks as well, and be on the lookout for the replay, everyone. We will do our best to get it to you by about this time tomorrow. So with that, we will say good day and conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.